Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a real icon, a machine whose name basically is the Eastern Front victory, the Soviet T-34 tank. It's always held up as the symbol of wartime efficiency, maybe revolutionary design, the thing that got the Red Army to Berlin.
It really is probably the most romanticized piece of kit from World War II, isn't it? But when you actually dig into the historical sources, the technical reports, Soviet internal documents, memoirs, a very different picture starts to emerge. Our mission today really is to unpack that legend, because the sources, they're pretty clear. This idea of the T-34 being this all-encompassing success, it's largely mythology. In 41-42, before they made some really critical fixes, the T-34 was, by almost any objective measure, it was a technical dud, a very bad tank.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty strong statement. Technical dud. So you're saying the tank that fought the whole war, the symbol of the Soviet war machine, was fundamentally flawed. How does that even work? How can something be this huge success story in the history books, but a mechanical failure out in the field? That paradox, that's exactly what we need to unpack for you today. So let's start at the beginning, the concept, right? The genesis of the T-34. It was designed under, immense pressure. And its DNA wasn't entirely Soviet, was it? It goes back to the BT series, the Bystrokhodny tank, the high-speed tank.
That's right.
Which itself came from those J. Walter Christie designs from America.
Exactly. The T-34 was really the final evolution of that whole high-speed philosophy. It kept key things from the BT tanks, that complex Christie suspension, a pretty powerful rear engine, 400, 500 horsepower. And the whole design doctrine was mobility, mobility.
Yeah.
Deep penetration, breaking through, not just supporting infantry.
But then reality hit. Combat lessons, especially from the Spanish Civil War, right? They showed speed wasn't quite enough.
Yeah, that forced a rethink. They realized they needed better armor and, critically, more firepower.
So that led to some big design shifts.
They really did. They started with a lighter concept, the A-20, about 20 tons. But the demands of, modern war pushed it up to the 26-ton T-34. This is where you get those famous features. They brought in that steeply sloped armor, which, interestingly, they adapted from other designs, even the French FCM-36, apparently.
Really? The French?
Yeah, it increases effective thickness dramatically. And, crucially, they changed the main gun. They moved away from the specialized 45-millimeter anti-tank gun to a much bigger 76-millimeter universal gun.
Okay, that universal gun concept is key, isn't it? It wasn't just about killing tanks anymore.
Exactly. Its job got way broader. Now it had to take out artillery, bunkers, enemy troops, everything.
So on paper, in 1940, what did it look like?
On paper, it looked like the best tank in the world, honestly. 45-millimeter sloped armor, that 76-millimeter gun, a diesel engine giving it great range, theoretically 300 kilometers, and a projected top speed of 55 kilometers per hour. That was faster than pretty much anything the Germans had in numbers then. Even the later Panther matched that speed. But this was 1940. The promise was just huge.
Right, the promise. But blueprints aren't battles, and this is where we get to the difficult part. What the Soviets themselves called the bubel, the technical dud. And it wasn't like nobody saw it coming. You mentioned senior officers, like Marshal Kulik. They were against rushing it into production in 1940.
They were fiercely opposed. They saw these fundamental flaws, things that would cripple it in the field. But Stalin was, deeply afraid of an imminent invasion. He pushed it through. Production started immediately, despite the warnings.
And that haste, it created serious problems.
A mechanical crisis, really.
Yeah.
If you had to pick the single worst flaw, the one that just killed early T-34s and, tragically, their crews, it was the air filter system.
The air filter. It sounds so basic. What was the specific issue there?
It was called the Pomon filter. Just a disaster. They basically just carried it over from the lighter BT tanks. It was completely inadequate for the heavier, hotter T-34 engine, especially in the dust and dirt of the Eastern Front. So the engine just sucked in dirt, grit. It acted like sandpaper on the pistons, the cylinders. Its official resource, its lifespan, was meant to be about 100 hours.
Yeah.
But often, they failed way, way sooner. The Americans tested one at Aberdeen Proving Ground in 42.
Right, I read about that.
The engine seized up completely, destroyed itself after just 343 kilometers. An entire tank basically wrecked because it couldn't breathe clean air.
That just blows my mind. It completely negates the whole mobility advantage, doesn't it? What good is 55 kilometers if your engine dies before you've even gone a decent distance?
Precisely. And the engine, that was just the start of the nightmare for the driver. Assuming they could keep the engine running and they had to fight the transmission. The early 4-speed gearbox, it was awful. Really poor synchronization.
Yeah, I remember reading about the sheer effort needed just to change gears. It sounds less like driving and more like, I don't know, wrestling a bear.
That's not far off.
Hmm.
Shifting between second and third gear, the sources say it took about 30 kilograms of force. Imagine doing that constantly in combat.
30 kilos.
Yeah, and trying to get it into fourth gear while moving. Basically impossible, they said, unless you maybe stopped or literally hit the lever with a hammer or something heavy.
So what was the result in practice?
The result was drivers often just gave up and ran it mainly in second and third. So forget that 55-kilometer top speed. Cross-country cruising speed was often down around maybe 15 kilometers per hour. Miserable.
So these technical issues directly impacted the crew, making their lives hellish even before combat. What else was wrong inside? The ergonomics.
Oh, they were brutal. 4 crew members: driver, radio operator, loader, and commander. Packed in like, well, the phrase like sardines comes up a lot in the reports. But maybe the single biggest ergonomic flaw, the one with the biggest tactical impact, was making the commander also be the gunner.
Right, so the guy who's supposed to be looking around, spotting threats, directing the tank, maybe other tanks, he's also got his head down, aiming the main gun.
Exactly. It cripples situational awareness. He can't command effectively, and he probably can't aim that effectively either because his attention is split. And then add the communication problems, the internal intercoms. Unreliable, often broken. So crews ended up resorting to, like, kicking each other or using hand signals to pass commands. In the middle of a battle. Imagine that.
And the air quality inside. You mentioned propellant gas poisoning. That sounds terrifying.
It's horrifying when you read the details. The ventilation was just terrible. After firing just 3 or 4 shots from that big 76-millimeter gun, the concentration of toxic gases inside the turret, carbon monoxide, other stuff, it shot up to 10 times the maximum safe level.
10 times?
Yeah. So you're asking your crew to fight effectively while literally being poisoned by their own weapon. I mean, what good is having this powerful gun if your crew is suffocating, dizzy, basically incapacitated after the first few shots?
It paints a picture of a tank designed with almost no thought for the humans inside. And on top of all that, you had basic quality control issues.
Absolutely, especially in the early war period, 41-42. Production was rushed. Quality control was often non-existent. You had poor welds that could crack, holes that weren't sealed properly. They leaked water when it rained, which could ruin radios, ammunition, track pins breaking, constantly immobilizing the tank. You see reports of huge numbers of T-34s abandoned, not because of enemy action, but just because they broke down.
So this brings us to the comparison. How did this early, flawed T-34 stack up against what the Germans had, say, the Panzer III? The Soviets actually tested one, didn't they?
They did in 1940. And when you compare the functional reality, not just the paper specs, the Panzer III had some really crucial advantages. It just worked better.
Okay, but hold on. We do need to address the T-34 shock in 1941. The Germans were terrified when they first met it, right? Their standard anti-tank guns, the 37mm, just bounced off that sloped armor. Doesn't that contradict the dud idea?
That's the core of the paradox, isn't it? It had genuinely revolutionary armor protection for its time. That part is true. The Germans were shocked by its survivability against their small guns. But survivability isn't the whole story. The Panzer III, while maybe less well-armored initially, it offered his crew much better observation, good optics, a commander's cupola. It had reliable internal communication, radios that worked, a much smoother suspension torsion bars versus the T-34's harsher Christie system. All things that kept the crew fighting effectively for longer.
And stealth.
Right. The Panzer III's engine was relatively quiet. You could only hear it from maybe 200 meters away. The T-34's diesel, it had this characteristic roar you could hear from 450 meters or more. It basically announced its arrival.
So the German crews often had the advantage of spotting the T-34 first. That's huge in tank combat.
First shot capability is often decisive. And then there's the actual firepower comparison, which is also not as simple as bigger gun is better.
What do you mean? The T-34 had the 76mm. The Panzer III often had a 50mm.
True. But by 42-43, the main Panzer III gun was the long-barreled 50mm KWK 39L60. Yes, it's a smaller caliber than the T-34's F-34 gun. But crucially, the German gun fired its shell at a much higher muzzle velocity. We're talking about 835 meters per second compared to the T-34's 655.
And higher velocity means better penetration, especially at range.
Exactly. Especially if the Germans were using their tungsten cord ammunition, the Panzer III could often penetrate and destroy an early T-3476 from, say, a kilometer away. That was often outside the effective range where the T-34's gun could reliably penetrate the Panzer III's frontal armor at the time. So the smaller gun actually had the edge in penetration in many situations.
Okay, so let's recap the situation in 41-42. The T-34 is unreliable, exhausting, and dangerous for its crew, maybe even outgunned at range by its main German counterpart, yet thousands were being churned out. That's just tragic.
The human cost was staggering, throwing crews into these flawed machines. But, and this is the critical part, the Soviets knew about the problems. They never stopped working on fixing those fundamental flaws they'd identified back in 1940. And by 1943, the strategic situation had stabilized somewhat. They had evacuated industries, Lend-Lease was kicking in, they had the breathing room to actually implement major redesigns and improve production quality.
Right, this is the turning point. This is where the T-34 starts to maybe live up to the legend. What were the key fixes?
They went right back to those core problems we discussed. First, that disastrous Pullman air filter. It got replaced.
Yeah.
Initially by a system called the cyclone filter, and then an even better one, the multi-cyclone.
And that made a real difference.
A massive difference. Suddenly, the engine wasn't constantly eating dirt. The cyclone filter allowed maybe 4 hours of safe running before needing a clean. The multi-cyclone pushed that to maybe 8 hours or more. This single change, fixing a relatively simple component, it transformed the tank's operational viability. It went from being a liability that might break down any minute to something you could actually rely on for a mission.
Okay, so the engine becomes reliable. What about the poor driver?
They addressed that too. Second big fix, a new, improved 5-speed gearbox. This drastically reduced the physical effort needed to shift gears. That crushing 30-kilogram force we talked about, it came down to a much more manageable 15 kilograms. Finally, the tank became something a normal, trained soldier could actually drive effectively in combat without needing superhuman strength.
And then came the big one, the T-34-85.
Yeah, late 1943, early 1944. This was a huge step. After years of trying, they finally managed to redesign the hull slightly to accommodate a wider turret ring. This allowed them to mount a much larger, properly designed 3-piston turret. Crucially, this separated the commander's job from the gunner's job.
Fixing that critical situational awareness flaw.
Exactly. The commander could command, the gunner could aim. And inside that new turret, they mounted the potent 85mm gun. Now, finally, the T-34 had the firepower needed to effectively engage the newer, heavier German tanks like the Tiger and the Panther, at least on more reasonable terms.
So the T-34 that people picture rolling into Berlin in 1945, the iconic image, that was actually a very different beast mechanically and ergonomically from the T-34 fighting near Moscow in 41.
Fundamentally different. The later T-334-76 models produced from mid-1943 onwards, and especially the T-33-85, were far more reliable, more user-friendly, just better tanks. Which really brings us back to how we should assess a tank. We always talk about the big three: firepower, armor, mobility. But that's not enough, is it? A truly holistic assessment has to include reliability, engine life, the transmission, crew ergonomics. How easy is it to actually use? Situational awareness, communications. The early T-34, well, it pretty much failed on all those crucial other factors. What good is a powerful gun if the crew suffocates? What good is high speed if the engine seizes or the gearbox breaks?
So if it was so bad for so long, how did it become such an enduring legend? What cemented that status?
I think it comes down to two things: mass and necessity, just sheer numbers. The sources state over 55,000 T-34s of all types were built, an incredible number. Now, maybe 42,000 of those were lost or destroyed.
That's a huge loss rate.
Staggering attrition. But because they built so many, the Red Army could absorb those losses and still have T-34s everywhere, all the time, overwhelming the Germans through sheer presence. The T-34 ultimately succeeded, not because it was perfect in 41, but because it was good enough to be built in vast numbers, and crucially, it was simple enough to be refined and fixed over time. Unlike, say, the German Panther. Also flawed, especially early on, but far too complex and expensive to be produced or fixed in the kind of numbers needed.
So it really is Stalin's famous line, isn't it? Quantity is also quality. The T-34's strategic impact came from its mass production potential and its eventual hard-won improvements.
Absolutely. But the price for getting there, for that evolution, was immense. Think about the designer's purge, the horrendous conditions those early crews endured, fighting in a vehicle that was actively trying to kill them through fumes or mechanical failure. That saying, "it's hellish in a human tank," was tragically accurate for the early T-34 crews. They paid the price so later crews had a better machine.
It's an incredible story. What it really tells us, I think, is that in war, sometimes the biggest strategic outcomes hinge on the smallest, grittiest details. A revolutionary concept can be completely undermined by something as simple as, well, a badly designed air filter. The macro depends on the micro working.
It really does. And that leads us to maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Consider this.
Yeah.
Without the massive industrial aid from the Allies through Lend-Lease, high-quality machine tools, raw materials, things that helped the Soviets stabilize and improve their factory production quality significantly by 1943. Could the T-34 ever have overcome those initial catastrophic mechanical flaws in time? Would it still have become that symbol of victory, or would the technical problems have doomed it before the fixes could arrive? Something to think about.